Climate change is likely to have a big impact on the sea that surrounds us, and there is evidence that it already does. On Agenda tonight, I talked to DEFA member Michelle Haywood MHK about blue carbon and the potential for marine plants to take more significant amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. I also used the opportunity to quiz Southern MHK's Haywood and Moorhouse over the lack of progress on a new Castle Rushen High School and the recent debacle over the Southern swimming pool. Talking to Michelle Haywood MHK for Rushen, and we're talking about blue carbon. Why are you the spokesperson for blue carbon?
I really happily for me, actually, after Claire Barber agreed to be minister at DEFA, she invited me to come and join the department, and I've ended up with delegation for the Environment Directorate, which is where the blue carbon and the marine research sits. So it comes under my bag politically. But as you know from my past and the extensive scuba diving and marine science that I've done anyway, it's right up my street, to be fair.
So for most people, they may have got their heads around the idea that planting trees is a good thing because it captures carbon. Yeah. But blue carbon, it's to do with stuff growing in the sea. How does that help?
It is. I think, you know, we started out with trees on land, didn't we? And we said, plant trees and let's capture carbon. But we've realised now that grasslands capture a lot of carbon and soil captures a lot of carbon and peat captures lots of carbon as well. So our understanding on land is still building. Once you get to the sea, because most people look out and all you see is the surface of the sea and you don't see what's underneath there, then it becomes an even more complicated picture. So we know that there's a variety of marine animals and algae and stuff that live down there that will be taking carbon out of the water and will be building it into their biological molecules. Some of that stuff will end up in the sediment, so the carbon will be locked away in the sediment in the sea. What we don't understand yet is what the scale of that is and how much of that is actually there.
So the study that's been announced, is that primarily to assess what's actually happening at the moment, or is it to look into opportunities for expanding the, kelp forests or whatever it might be, or a mix of both perhaps?
Yeah. The initial study is to scope out what we've got there. So we know there are some very important habitats that do sequester an awful lot of carbon. So things like eelgrass, for example, is really good at sequestering carbon. We don't fully understand the extent of those eelgrass beds around the Isle of Man yet. So one of the piece of work is to sort of capture that and how far that extends. We don't understand how much carbon sits in our sediment layers. So although we've got data from the work that was done with Bangor University, where they take cameras down to various locations and we know what the seabed substrate looks like around most of the island, we don't understand when we actually look in detail at that how much carbon is in those layers. And so this preliminary year is to basically try and scope out what's there and try and get some sort of baseline data so that we can look then. The work going forward from that for the next couple of years will be looking at how do we manage that, how do we keep that carbon there that's there already, because we don't need to release any more carbon out into the atmosphere, and then what steps can we take to enhance that carbon if it's possible.
And to a certain extent we're on to a winner with this, in as much as there have been quite a significant number of areas that have been closed to dredge fisheries. And unfortunately, I don't dive. Maybe I ought to at some point, but so I don't know what sort of an impact that has had. But I imagine by not having the dredge fishery, there's been quite a lot of recovery of plant life on those areas.
The Isle of Man's really we're ahead of the game, really, in terms of protecting areas of seabed. You know, we protect a huge proportion of our seabed. And within marine nature reserves, you can allow certain activities. So you could allow the low impact activities. There's crab and lobster potting goes on and things like that. So that's kind of one aspect where we're already ahead of the game in terms of management, and we've got a very strong fisheries team as well that are constantly looking at what's happening in terms of the gear that's being used, and it's possible that we might suggest that there needs to be a switch in fishing gear to reduce how much carbon gets released from environments. But you're right, we are, in terms of our marine management, we've probably got one of the best structures in place to actually take the best advantage of the carbon that we can capture in the sea.
Another of the really positive, certainly in terms of human activity, one of the positives that comes from this, and there are several, are that by protecting certain areas and allowing the plant life to grow, you find that certainly fish can use this as kind of nursery grounds. There's opportunity. The scallops actually land on the weed, and the spat can then develop. So there's quite a lot of potential positives in terms of increasing the amount of fish and shellfish in the seas if we protect areas.
There is, and I think one of the massive advantages for the Isle of Man is that we've got Port Erin Closed Area, which was the original closing area of seabed off in order to improve surrounding fisheries. But what we know now is that area hasn't been dredged or touched, and so what's happened there, and I appreciate you're not a diver, I'm not going to offer to take you, it's a bit too deep to be fair. But what you see on the seabed there is you see a huge amount of life that lives on the sea, so things that don't have a land-based equivalent, hydroids and sea pens and the starfish and everything like that. There are lots and lots of life across there. It'd be really interesting to look at the sediment from that area that hasn't been touched at all for over 30 years now, and to compare that with what's been going on outside, because that'll give you an idea of, if you have dredged the seabed, how much of that carbon was released. We know that dredging can cause problems on the seabed. The bycatch and everything is obvious, the stuff that comes on deck, and there's obviously the damage that happens to the seabed as well. But as I say, we're in a really good position because we are protecting so much of our seabed already, and we have excluded those fisheries that were causing big damage inland. When you dive somewhere like Port Erin Closed Area, it's a slightly trippy dive actually, because the scallops down there, we're used to seeing scallops at, sort of the size of your hand, but actually they're about half as big again. They are huge because some of them will be 20 years old. I don't know how long scallops live for. We have a competition every time we have to do survey stuff down there to try and find the biggest scallops that we can, because I'm sure if they're anywhere, they're going to be in that area. So it starts sort of almost changing your perception about what you're seeing. It's a bit Alice in Wonderland type moment, that things don't look the same size as you're expecting. But it's just a signal of how much you could be locking away in the marine environment. And
certainly one of my regrets as fishery minister, I didn't have too many, but when I was fishery minister,
regrets, I have a few.
Well, yeah, but one of the regrets was that we never got a dived scallop fishery, and I know that was something that you were quite interested in yourself. I mean, is that something that potentially could happen? I mean, certainly if the results of this survey come back and say actually there's lots of opportunity and potential for locking up carbon by way of blue carbon, potentially more areas could then be closed, which then allows the potential for more fisheries like dived scallop fisheries.
I think there will almost certainly be a move in the future away from really damaging fisheries mechanisms and equipment, and so I think you'll see a shift in the gear, and I think you'll see a shift in procedures as well. I sincerely believe still to this day that dive caught scallops are probably the lowest impact that you can have on an environment, because not only are you only taking the scallops that you're going to harvest, but you can also survey for what's down there while you're doing it, so you're managing catch levels, and there's clear scope there for a leased area of seabed that allows a company to come in and manage that catch sensibly so that it's sustainable.
The dredge scallop fishermen, certainly there was one famous occasion. I remember one of the Scottish fellows suggesting that actually the big trawlers were the best because they spend the least amount of time damaging the seabed, but obviously they damage more. But then he also used this analogy that in effect it's a bit like farmers ploughing fields. And I suppose over the last 10, 15 years, what we have done in terms of managing scallop fisheries is reduce significantly the area which is dredged and significantly improve the gear to reduce the damage. So I mean, is that analogy to ploughing fields a fair one, or is that just a fisherman's tale?
Well, it's one I hear often quoted. I don't think it's a fair one, because actually and you mentioned scallop spat earlier. What we know is that the small scallop spat needs something to settle onto. So often that's onto a substrate called merle, which is like a sort of pink, almost like a little baby coral, cold water coral type structure. And that's great for the scallop spat to settle, but it's absolutely it's slow growing and completely destroyed if you dredge across it. So actually, I think it probably goes the other way, that too much dredging doesn't allow for the scallop spat, and then doesn't allow for that population to be replaced. So there has to be a balance between the areas that you protect. And there was some great particle tracking data that showed where the scallop spat settle out of the water. So we know which ones those important areas are, and protecting those so that you can then get the overspill catch is a sign of a well-managed fishery. But I don't think I'm going to go with a ploughed field, because I'm preparing the seabed.
And I mean, there are the other opportunity there that exists, and again, this possibly takes a bit of an imagination leap on the part of the listener. Is it can actually help in terms of coastal defences. Certainly there's evidence that kelp forests, for example, if there are if there's sufficient amount of kelp, places, for example, such as Bay na Carrica in your patch, there's a significant problem with the road there and frequent overtopping. Kelp forests can actually significantly reduce the energy of storms as they're coming in, and actually reduce the need for substantial coastal defences.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think if you think of the Big Bay and Douglas Bay has the same sort of rocky substrate with sand interspersed as Bay na Carrica does, and so what you'll see there is kelp will naturally grow, and of course the flip side is you get people complaining about seaweed on the beach when it has been stormy, but it does absorb an awful lot of energy from there, and it's completely different if you head round to Port Erin side. And Port Erin Bay is mostly sandy across it, and so kelp can't really get hold in there. So there isn't. There's some seaweed washes up on Port Erin Beach, but it's not the same scale because it's just the wrong seabed substrate. So I think in terms of could we increase what's down there, you'd have to artificially engineer the seabed in order to increase more rocky substrate for the kelp to hold onto. What we can do is not do damaging activities. So I suspect Bay na Carrica, given that it's been closed now for 5 or 6 years, I think, aren't we, to dredging, has probably recovered some more of that weed than you would have otherwise seen, because it's been allowed a chance to grow. And I think some of the management going forward will be more about what we don't do than what we can do to enhance stuff.
So going back to the original issue then, the scientists are starting work fairly shortly. And when are we expecting a result from all of this?
The preliminary results will be within the first year. That's where all the survey stuff. So we should know the areas. We should know estimates about what carbon is locked away in different types of habitats. So that will give us a good baseline to start for. And then after that, it's working through how do you manage into the future, and even things that are happening in the marine environment. We started talking about marine spatial planning the other day, but things like whether we're going to have another interconnector for power coming into the island, which way that routes might be affected by what we find, because if it's going to route through a really, really carbon rich environment, there's probably the chance to say, well, actually, let's swerve around that and let's do something less damaging. So it will be important to have that information so that we can make sensible decisions about what activities we're doing in the sea.
And it is really important to be able to make informed decisions. So this is going to significantly enhance our understanding of what our seabed has on it. And of course, we've got to remember that, is it something like 87% of our territory is seabed?
It's a huge amount of territory, isn't it? I think the thing with scientists, and you'll know this from having been in the department, is they'll ask one question, think of a way of answering that, and then in the meantime they'll have thought of 3 more questions, and so there will always be more science and more answers they want to go and look for, and that's great. It's a in that respect, it's a brilliant department to work in, because you have all these inquiring people who are really passionate about their particular area of expertise. That's going to be, we've been building on the science that started in your time. You can see it now evolving through, and so things like the inshore crab and potting boats are starting to get trackers on them soon. So we'll actually be able to evaluate where those boats are and where that activity is concentrated, which is data we just haven't known up until now. And lobster and crab potting is fairly low impact on the environment. You're only taking catch that's the right size. It's all that's a good news story. But knowing where that activity concentrates, it will allow us to manage those stocks a little better as well. So I think we're gradually chipping away at trying to understand how it all fits together.
And are there any regrets when you're sat in a dull Tynwald or House of Keys sitting? Do you ever think, gosh, I wish I was under the sea looking at these fantastic habitats?
Well, not till now, because the election was in September and there hasn't been much diving going on, although this weekend's looking fantastic. That's going to get harder as we go through summer. I'm not going to lie. I'm trying still. I've been in twice, I think, this year so far, just because the weather's been rubbish. But we do get some time off, so and I'm going to try and dress it up as maybe I'll do a bit of the science while I'm down there, just like kind of nudge it as a work do rather than actually taking time off.
You're listening to MHK for Rushen Michelle Haywood. So what's she been doing for the South? As a Southern MHK, there are two big issues that have hit the headlines in, I suppose, the course of the last 2 or 3 months. One is that Castle Rushen seems to have dropped out of the Pink Book in terms of clear commitments, and the other one, of course, is the Southern Swimming Pool. Now, I know you were a member of the pool board for a short time, so you won't have been that surprised at the problems that the pool is facing.
No, I think that the problems with the pool funding, they're systematic problems that have occurred over years, and the subvention was frozen over 10 years ago. It then didn't pick up again once we got through the VAT crisis at the time. It was never revisited, and it sat there as a declining proportion of the operating costs. The pool board have tried a number of things to try and restructure, to try and change staff over onto modern contracts, to try and change working hours and things. I think there's some sort of legacy stuff of when government moved away from Whitley Council contracts and they moved everyone lock, stock and barrel. Local authorities and local authority boards were left out of that move across. And so you end up with some very expensive staff contracts to maintain. And I'm not saying that staff don't deserve the rights that are written in their contracts, but it does cost an awful lot of money for some of those positions. So that's been hampering the pool. The lack of subvention increase has been hampering them, and it's an ageing pool structure, and so it does cost more. It's not well insulated. You obviously have to heat the water. That's heated by gas. That was all a really bad news story. It was before, but the infrastructure is just getting tired and old. The extractor fans only work for so long. It's a fairly harsh environment for them in the damp there. So the pool is an expensive pool relative to, say, the newer pools up in Ramsey. And I think in my time on the board and then running forward, all you're doing is firefighting. The board's been living hand to mouth for a while, and COVID really, really knocked everything for six, because the board, with all the best conscience in the world, decided that staff would still need to be paid. You recognise that staff have, even if they were on contracts that said, well, we could stop paying them, but they still had mortgages and they still had bills to pay, and so the staff did get their pay during that time, and the board did the morally right thing. But when you've got reduced income, that's added to the financial problems down there.
But it does appear that the pool, at least the financial future of the pool, is secure till for the next 12 months. Yeah. So that's a positive.
Oh, that's definitely a positive. It was what the pool board had been working on, a survival plan, and they'd asked for a year's support basically to see if they could turn things round, restructure how the staffing works, and try and get things back on an even keel. But I think that the overall problem is that most of that support from the subvention was stopped. And if you go back to the initial pool creation, the central government was going to pick up 75% of the running cost of the pool, and that's declined to about 52%, I think. So that decline basically has undermined their ability to do anything. And you know what it's like with maintenance. If you don't keep up with it, it comes back to bite you later on, and it's more expensive to solve the problem when something fails. And so that's what that pool is facing.
During the election campaign, the former education minister was pretty adamant that the plans for Castle Rushen were almost ready to go, and things were going to happen. And then, 3 or 4 months after the election, budget comes out. Castle Rushen, which had been a clear commitment, no longer there as a clear commitment in the budget. Have you been asleep on the job? What's happened? Because the school was almost ready to be built.
I think actually we came in knowing that's the commitments that have been made, and that the school was ready. The playing fields have already been started. The underground heating is all in there. The ground source heating is all there, ready to go. The ground's settling. It'll be playable in a year's time. So that was the first phase, and then we all expected the next phase was that the current playing fields would start having building works on them. I think we were all stunned that it's just disappeared off the agenda, as it seems, as far as Treasury and DSE are concerned. The building itself is in very poor condition, but the layout of the school is poor. It doesn't help the staff in the running and the management of school. Even moving around the corridors can be difficult between lessons, and it's just not a safe environment for our children to be in. So we are all very, very deeply concerned that it seems to just being kicked down the road now.
And, presumably, a lot of talking has been going on behind the scenes since the budget. Are commitments now being sought that this is going to get pushed back into the budget for next year?
We are repeatedly asking the questions. I'm sure you've listened to the keys recently. The group known as the Beautiful South seem to dominate the question paper, and Castle Rushen is one that comes up on a regular basis. I think the nice thing is that there's a really good working relationship between all the Southern MHKs and some of our MLCs that are based down there as well. And so with matters like the pool and the school, we've all been talking to each other, and we're all working together to try and take those projects forward.
Questions are an important way of raising matters. But a lot of to actually achieve things, you've got to be talking to people. You've got to be having the meetings and, I suppose, issuing the political threats.
Yes.
So presumably all that is happening.
That's
too.
happening. Yeah. I think we've all of us met with the Department of Education over the last few weeks. We've all had discussions about what needs to happen and why we're so concerned that there seems to be very little will from the department to push on with this.
MHK for Questions Jason Moorhouse has queried a lot, but what meaningful action has he been taking? It's fair to say that a number of your questions focus on constituency-related matters, and yet Castle Rushen, for the first time, I think, it no longer appears in the Pink Book as a clear commitment. It's in the long grass section of the Pink Book in the budget. Minister Edge appears to be far from convinced that we need a pool in the south of the island. Yeah. Are your questions actually being effective, or indeed,
definitely.
Are the 4 Southern MHKs? Have you been asleep on the job?
Oh, certainly not. And I'd go beyond 4. We've actually got 6 members of Tynwald from the south of the island, and as a block, that's quite significant because we always talk about Coming being a block, and all 6 of us are outside Coming, so we're actually quite active. In terms of my questions, I've been very productive in terms of the number of questions asked, but also in terms of following things up. So if you actually look at the questions asked on the school, there has been a movement to kind of ensure that there are dates being referred to, that there's actually items being referred to that you can then go back to and say, on such and such a date we referred to this, what difference does it make? So a recent question was looking at the work that's being done in the new fields, and I went back and said this work's been done in terms of a consequence and a positive add-on. What is that doing to the next stage of the development? So I'm always looking at how you can actually get more mileage out of each question. So Yeah, that's important. But also, I would say that a significant number of my questions do have local links, but virtually all of them do have that national significance. So, if you look at something like the Peggy, we had a brilliant presentation by Manx National Heritage recently in Tynwald, and it was really significant that at the start of that process, the Minister said, "Thank you, Mr. Moorhouse, for keeping going on this and raising this awareness." And it's good to see that, kind of nibbling away at the edges sometimes helps things move to fruition. And you don't get instant access to change as a backbencher, but you can help get movement. And
have you been offered a job yet? Because I know you didn't take on any role when the initial round of sweeties were handed out by Chief Minister Cannon. Any movements there yet?
No, it was on Thursday, that was, because I went to see the Chief Minister at 9:30 in the morning, and I spoke to him again at 4:00, and during the course of the day, the house went from being quite tipped to absolutely fantastic. I cleaned every bit of the house. It was like lockdown 1 again. But in terms of taking a position, I had things offered, but I did want to remain on the Economic Policy Review Committee, and the things I had offered would have meant I would have become a member of department, but lost out on my scrutinising role on the Economic Policy Review Committee.
Has the Southern MHK's focus on questions meant they've irritated government, which appears to have dropped Southern priorities? Or do the questions achieve the results without the hard work of behind-the-scenes politics? Blue carbon has great potential, and it seems that there's nothing to lose from investing in it. Reduced atmospheric carbon, more habitat for fish to breed and juveniles to grow, and even the potential to reduce the impact of damage caused by storms. Please get in touch with Phil Gawne at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. But for now, I'm Phil Gawne, Guramayo. Thanks for listening.